Thank you for the invitation. Great to be here, even though virtually. So I would like to talk about geometric ML and how it is applied to molecular design. So starting with some of the principles that underlie these methods, and basically how we can use them for different problems in biochemistry and structural biology. So I would start with the main concept that underlies these kind of architectures, and this is symmetry. And this is a quote from Weil, one of the most important mathematicians of the 20th century. He wrote very poetically about symmetry as one idea by which we tried to comprehend and create order, beauty, and perfection. We know that this is a Greek term. Actually, the Greeks believed symmetry to be foundational in their idea of how the universe is constructed. Plato, for example, believed that all the stuff around us is built of tiny symmetric polyhedra that nowadays we call Platonic solids. So this is actually not that a crazy idea if you think of how crystals are organized. So that's exactly this. The Greeks are also credited with inventing, or at least formalizing, the geometry that we still teach at school as the geometry, right? Euclidean geometry. And as you probably know, it was based on 5 axioms or postulates, and the 5th one about parallel lines stood out, and it took quite some time to try to prove it to no avail until in the 19th century came the realization that you can actually construct self-consistent geometries that do not assume the 5th postulate about parallel lines from Euclidean geometry, and in fact it created a zoo of different geometries that didn't assume this postulate. So it required at some point a complete revamping or revisiting of what is actually meant by geometry and how we define it. And this insight came in 1872 from Felix Klein, and it entered the history of mathematics as the Erlangen program. So this new idea that you can define geometry in an algebraic way by considering some space where your geometric objects live, on which you can act with some transformations that form a group. And this way you can study the properties of objects that remain unaffected or invariant under the action of this group. And for example, the classical Euclidean geometry, you can actually derive it from first principles by assuming rigid motions, right? So it's all the properties that are unaffected by translation, rotation, and reflection. Now you can take bigger groups such as a affine group or projective group. And in fact, Klein, together with Eugenio Beltrami, was able to construct the first formal model of hyperbolic geometry using what is now called the Klein-Beltrami model. So basically, that's a certain projection that is employed. So that was the first version of non-Euclidean geometry with negative curvature. Now, these realizations, I already mentioned Weil. He played a very important role in pitching this idea to physicists. And in the beginning of the 20th century, the physicists got the realization that you can actually derive the very laws of universe from first principles of symmetry. And the most famous result is probably by Emmy Noether, that show that you can derive mathematically conservation laws from considerations of symmetry. So, for example, the conservation of energy can be derived from symmetry of time. And in certain generalized form that was developed by Young and Mills in the 50s, this has become what nowadays we call the standard model in particle physics. So it literally describes all the things that we know about how our universe works. So physicists typically distinguish between external symmetries. In this case, is what is called the Poincare group that gives rise to the Minkowski geometry of special relativity, and internal symmetries of the quantum fields that derive from which you can derive different forces or different interactions between particles. So I think it was very beautifully put by Philip Anderson, Nobel laureate in physics, that it's only slightly overstating to say that physics is the study of symmetry. Now, what does it have to do with deep learning? You can ask. And in deep learning, we have also a similar situation in the sense that we have a zoo of different architectures that historically were developed for different types of data from different considerations in different contexts, like convolutional neural networks were derived for image analysis problems and initially were inspired by works in neuroscience, and recurrent neural networks were derived for sequences, and graph neural networks actually have their origins in chemistry, as we'll see. So bottom line, we have apparently totally disconnected architectures that do not relate to each other. And I think probably one of the reasons why deep learning is considered as a kind of empirical field is because this kind of common mathematical view of these different architectures is lacking. So geometric deep learning is exactly this kind of perspective that tries through the perspective of symmetries and group theory, as we'll see, to unify different architectures, to provide a common denominator, and not only pedagogically explain why certain architectures work in a certain way, but also be able to derive new architectures. I think that was especially noticed in chemistry, where these kind of architectures, again, we'll see them in a few minutes, have become prominent in the past years. Now, if we look at the problem of machine learning in a very simple setting, right, supervised learning, where I give you samples of some function, right? So I have input examples and the output of this function for these known inputs. You can maybe a bit cynically say that this is some glorified curve fitting, right? So what you essentially try to do with some black box that typically looks like a neural network, you try to interpolate or extrapolate from a finite sampling, which we call the training set, some function that you don't know, right? And the class of functions is typically implemented by neural networks. So these are also not new architectures. So the early neural networks appeared in the late 50s, the famous work of Frank Rosenblatt on perceptrons. And we know that these architectures are actually universal in the mathematical sense, meaning that just two layers of perceptron can approximate to any desired accuracy any continuous function, right? So basically, they can represent more or less anything you want. Now, the problem that this result is typically, so it's a class of results called universal approximation theorems. You can go back to works of Kolmogorov and Arnold in the 50s, or even with a little bit of fantasy to Hilbert's 13th problem from the beginning of the 20th century. So it's a class of results with different settings, with different assumptions. They are typically not constructive. So they show that out of this class of functions, right, that are implemented by two-layer perceptron neural networks with certain assumptions on the activation functions, you can approximate to any epsilon any continuous function, but it doesn't tell how, right? So it doesn't tell typically what's the number of neurons. It doesn't tell how to find the weight of these architectures. So it is good to know, but it's not really useful in practice. So the first question that you may ask is, how many points do we need to approximate this function, right? And you need to assume some form of regularity, right? Because you can have infinitely many functions that are continuous and pass through your given points. So typical assumptions about regularity, right? So what mathematicians like the classes of regularity are Sobolev functions, for example, or Lipschitz continuous functions. So here we actually can see very easily that very well behaved functions mathematically do not work well in high dimensions, in the sense that the number of samples that you will need to take in order to obtain approximation to error epsilon will grow exponentially with a dimension. So these results are meaningful when you have 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, but machine learning problems typically deal with data that lives in 1,000-dimensional spaces or maybe million-dimensional spaces, right? So that's not uncommon. This is actually very common. And this is the problem that is known under the generic term of the curse of dimensionality, right? So it's a collection of geometric or probabilistic results that tell you that these bounds become useless. Now, the idea of geometric deep learning is to replace this standard form of regularity with stronger geometric regularity priors. And the idea is that your data is not just a point in high-dimensional space. It comes from a low-dimensional domain, such as a grid or a plane. And basically, we have signals that live on some geometric domain, right? So we distinguish between these two things. We have domain that we denote by omega, again, something like a grid, and signals that are functions defined on this domain. Now, the structure of the domain is described by having some symmetry group that can act on points on this domain, and by using the appropriate group representation, we can also act on signals that live on this domain. So in our case, in our example of images, this will be just the shift operator, right? If the group is the group of translations. Now, how you build this prior into your neural network architecture, you basically need to require your function that takes as input these signals and produces some output, let's say label of the image, to interact appropriately with this symmetry. And one way to interact with the symmetry is what we call invariance. So what I want to guarantee here is no matter, for example, how I move this cat around the image, I still want to say that this is a cat, right? So this is a very reasonable assumption in object recognition. So this is called invariance. So the function is unaffected by the action of the group. Another case is when the output space has the same structure as the input space. We want to have a more general notion of equivariance, in the sense that the output will be affected in the same way as the input, might use different representation of the same group. But this is, again, also a logical assumption. If, for example, my problem is segmenting the cat out of the background, and I shift the cat, I want the output to be shifted in the same way, right? The segmentation mask. Now, early geometric architectures, right? So we know that in the 60s, there was the first AI winter. So the neural networks fell out of fashion, and one of the reasons was a publication of a book by Minsky and Papert that showed, actually that provided probably the first time geometric group theoretical analysis of these architectures, and showed that perceptrons, or at least a certain class of architectures, or what they call simple perceptrons, single layer perceptrons, were unable to compute very simple predicates, very simple functions like exclusive OR. So there was a little bit of hiatus in the development of neural networks. And a new class of architectures came from the work of Hubel and Wiesel on the structure of the visual cortex, which showed that neurons in the brain, in the visual cortex, have local connectivity with shared weights, which inspired a new class of architecture called neocognitrons by Kunihiko Fukushima, and then the classical convolutional neural networks. So basically, the idea of convolutional neural networks is that of locality and shared parameters. So a single convolutional layer acts by basically weighted sum or average of nearby pixels, right, or nearby neurons, where the weights are shared, right? So if I move to a different location, the output might be different, but the way that it's obtained will be with exactly the same weight. So what it allows you is, if you write the mapping from the input to the output as a matrix, it allows you to recycle parameters. So the number of weights in this matrix will not be n squared, but it will be order of n, right? So, and this is exactly what is implemented as a convolution. In fact, I can derive the convolution as the only linear operator that is equivariant or commutes with the shift. So you can derive convolution from first principles of symmetry. So you can see that from this perspective of geometric deep learning, this is actually an obvious thing to do, right? So in retrospective, we can say it. So our domain here is a plane or a grid. We act on it with translation group. So on images, the corresponding representation is the shift operator. And as I said, convolution is an operator that commutes with the shift. So basically, convolutional layers come from first principles. Now, what I would like to talk today is a different kind of objects, which are graphs. And these objects are very prominent in chemistry. So in chemistry, I give you a molecule where we have atoms represented as nodes and edges represented as chemical bonds represented as edges in the graph, right? And I want to predict properties of these molecules. So this is a very typical problem in virtual drug screening and drug discovery, right? So I don't have the capacity to test all these molecules in the lab. So I would like to rule out some molecules that might not have desirable properties, such as, for example, if they're too toxic. So the problem here is that I can featureize these objects, right? Let's say that I look at the types of the atoms represented here by different colors, and I parse them into a vector, and then this vector can be provided as input to a neural network. The problem is that, unlike, for example, text, where we have a canonical ordering of the tokens, here we don't, right? So I can order my nodes in this molecule in any way I want, and the result will be different vectors, right? What we do want to say is that no matter how I order the atoms in the molecule, its properties do not change, right? So this is a very reasonable assumption. So this is just our way of thinking of this molecule, how in which order I refer to its atoms. But its solubility or toxicity doesn't change because of this. So we want the property that we call permutation invariance. And this property is implemented in graph neural networks. So graph neural networks, as we'll see in a few minutes, they operate by what is called message passing, in which case, again, we have this prior of locality and shared parameters. So every node receives information from its adjacent nodes, right? So other atoms that are connected by chemical bonds. And these parameters, these features are, for example, summed with certain weights, and we can repeat it multiple times. So the property here is permutation equivariance, right? Because if we change the order of the atoms in the molecule in the hidden representation, the atoms will change in the same way. And if we want to aggregate all the information to a single number like toxicity, we want a permutation invariant readout, right? So again, from the perspective of geometric deep learning blueprint, this is something that can be derived in an obvious way. So now our domain is a graph. The symmetry here is the permutation of the nodes. We can represent it. So the group representation here is permutation matrix. And then message passing will be a permutation equivariant function that we can apply multiple times on this graph. So, and interestingly related to this picture of physics, right, where we can distinguish between external symmetry and internal symmetry, in geometric deep learning, we can also distinguish between the symmetry of the domain, right, in this case, the symmetry of the graph, the permutation of the order of the nodes in our molecule or the atoms in our molecule, and the external symmetries, which will be the symmetries of the data. So in our case, a molecule is not just an arbitrary graph, which is a topological structure. It is a geometric graph, so it lives in three-dimensional space, and atoms have features that represent the three-dimensional coordinates of these atoms in the space. And what we want here is, no matter how we position the molecule in space, we want that to ensure that its properties are not changed, right? So if I rotate my molecule in space, it will still be the same way toxic, right? Note that we usually exclude reflections because the reflections affect the chirality of the molecule, and as a result, the properties can actually change. So we are usually talking only about rotations and translations, and this is what is called equivariant, which is a little bit of a tautology, because graph neural networks are already equivariant to permutations. So here, equivariant GNNs refer to being equivariant to additional symmetry, which is the rotation or translation of the data. So we call these geometric GNN or transformer architectures, and they have these two different symmetries, the symmetry of the domain and the symmetry of the data, and corresponding message passing algorithms. And as you probably know, these methods gained prominence in chemical applications and structural biology. Probably the most famous implementation is AlphaFold 2, the invariant point attention, and you can also find many different other applications like generative models for chemistry. If we have time, I will talk about it slightly in a more extended way. So same way as you can generate images, for example, with DALI or Midjourney, with diffusion models, you can also apply diffusion models to molecules. And there you want to make sure that your probability distributions, for example, are unaffected by rotations and translations, right? So you want some form of geometric invariance. So basically, from this perspective, again, many architectures can be seen as special instances of this blueprint, right? So, and we can associate different groups with different domains. So on grids, for example, the typical symmetry that is assumed is translation. On graphs, it is permutation, and on meshes, it's a special type of symmetry that is called gauge symmetry. So it has to do with the choice of the local system of coordinates, which you can choose up to rotation, which is on two-dimensional surfaces, right, that we use, for example, to model proteins at times. It is SO2, special orthogonal group of dimension 2. And we can also see, we have an entire book on this, that many popular architectures that you probably use are special instances and can be derived from these first principles. Now, so you can basically fit almost any neural network architecture into this blueprint of geometric deep learning. I would like to talk today mostly about graph neural networks. Graph neural networks are important because graphs appear more or less everywhere. You can think of roughly any object as a graph. So from very small things like molecules to larger biological systems such as interactomes that describe interaction between different chemical and biological entities, networks of people, right? Like social networks that might contain billions of nodes, right? So gigantic graphs that describe how people interact with each other. Now, I will be talking for simplicity about undirected graphs that have d-dimensional features attached to every node. So I denote by n the number of nodes, and we can represent these objects, right? It's not clear how to work with a graph on a computer, so allow me to represent them as these two matrices. We call it the feature matrix and the adjacency matrix, right? So adjacency matrix is a matrix where in position I, j, we have 1 if there is an edge between nodes I and j, and 0 otherwise. Now, by doing this, I'm already cheating from the very first moment, because I told you that we don't have canonical ordering of the nodes, and I write some matrices that assume some arbitrary ordering of the nodes. So in fact, I can order the nodes in different way, and I can obtain different matrices, right? How do they differ? They differ up to permutation. So permutation of the rows in the case of feature matrix, and permutation of rows and columns in the case of adjacency matrices, right? So it's the same group that acts differently on tensors of different dimension, right? Or matrices and vectors. So basically, anything that we do with graphs must account for this ambiguity that is built into the problem. Now, the two types of problems that we would like to consider in this domain is graph-wise predictions, like predicting properties of molecules, right? I give you a graph and you want to output, let's say, a single number, or node-wise predictions, where I give you a graph, let's say, social network, and you want to determine who is a spammer on the social network, right? So in this case, I want to output, for example, labels for every node of the graph. So in the first case, we are interested in functions that take as input the graph structure, right? Adjacency matrix A, and the node features in the form of matrix X, sorry. And no matter how I permute their order, the output should be the same, right? So we call this property permutation invariance. In the second type of problems, the output has the same structure as the input. So if I permuted the input, the output must be permuted in the same way. We call this property permutation equivariance, right? P here denotes any permutation matrix. And graph neural networks essentially apply multiple steps of permutation equivariant layers. They produce node embeddings, right, or some vectors that represent the nodes of the graph. And if the task requires node-wise predictions, we can also aggregate everything in a permutation invariant way and obtain a graph-wise prediction for this input. Now, the way that these functions are computed, you can do it in many different ways. The 99% of graph neural networks operate by what is called message passing. So every node considers only its neighbors, right? And the corresponding features that are associated to these neighbors that together form what is called the multiset, right? So it's a set where the same element can appear more than once. Now, I remind you that we don't have canonical ordering of the nodes. So the way that we aggregate this information must be invariant to the permutation, right? So basically, this must be a permutation invariant function. And we apply this function to every node of the graph. So by doing this, we obtain an output for every node of the graph that is permuted in the same way as the input is permuted, right? So in other words, this is a permutation equivariant function. And most graph neural network architectures differ in the way that this function is chosen or designed. And here it's appropriate to actually ask the question, what kind of functions can be computed by this architecture, right? Or by this broad class of architectures that are called message passing, right? And we know the answer to this, right? So we can think, first of all, of different types of message passing, right? So the easiest way is just to say that I aggregate all my neighbors as a sum that is weighted by the adjacency matrix of the graph, right? So these are called convolutional type architectures, because when the graph becomes a grid, this boils down to the standard convolution. The typical node-wise transformation is a linear function, right? So it's a weight matrix that is called channel mixing, right? So it operates along the dimensions of the features, and it is the same at every node. And we can write it as this linear equation, right? So X is our feature matrix, A is the diffusion matrix, right? So this is what propagates information along the edges between adjacent nodes. And the channel mixing acts again. So this is the learnable matrix, and it acts on every node in the same way, right? So very simple architecture. It is highly scalable. There are many industrial use cases I would say probably nowadays, all the social network companies use some form of graph neural networks. So we also use it at Twitter at some point. And there are many statements about these architectures saying that they are not expressive enough, so they're too simple, and these kind of architectures work only on homophilic graphs, right? When I say homophilic, I mean that it's a graph where my neighbors are similar to myself. And the typical argument that is given is that this matrix A, if you look at it from signal processing perspective, it's a low pass filter, right? So I'm averaging myself with my neighbors. I will show you that this is not true. So the analysis must be much more nuanced, and it's not just a low pass filter. There is interaction between the two matrices A and W. Now, slightly more general flavor of GNNs is attentional GNNs. So in this case, again, we aggregate our neighbors with linear weights, but now the weights depend not only on the structure of the graph, but on the features themselves, right? Through the attention mechanism. So we have some learnable function that determines the weight based on how the features are, or what features we have at the endpoints of the edge. And this is very popular in transformers. As you probably know, transformers are a special type of GNNs. And the most general case is message passing architectures, right, where we have just a bivariate function that takes as input the feature vectors of at the two endpoints of an edge. Now, for this class of architectures, we can actually upper bound its expressive power by what is called Weiss-Frey-Lehmann graph isomorphism test. So it's a classical algorithm in graph theory that tries to determine whether two graphs are structurally equivalent or isomorphic. And under some mild assumptions, if our aggregation is injective, then the message passing is equivalent to Weiss-Frey-Lehmann test. And it was devised in the 60s by two Soviet mathematicians, Lehmann and Weisfeiler, actually inspired by problems in organic chemistry. So they tried to understand whether two molecules are structurally similar by testing their graph-based representations. And it's actually interesting that the very term graph was introduced by Sylvester in the late 19th century, referring to structural formulae that for the first time appeared in chemistry at that time. So it's interesting that graph theory has this very intimate relation to molecules and chemical compounds. So what does the WL test do? So basically what it does, it starts with a graph where every node is labeled in the same way, right? So we have, let's say, this blue color attached to every node, and it examines the structure of the neighborhoods around every node. And we have two types of neighborhoods, right? We have nodes with two neighbors and nodes with three neighbors. So if I apply an injective function, think of it as some form of hashing, for example, we can distinguish between these two types of nodes, right? So I can now refine the color, right? So I can change the labels in this graph, and now I have green nodes and yellow nodes, right? So I can repeat this procedure again, and now you can see that we have three types of neighborhoods, right? We have a green node with one yellow and one green neighbor. We have a green with two yellows, and we have a yellow with two greens and one yellow. And again, assuming injectivity, this will become three different labels. And we can repeat this procedure until the colors stop changing, at which point we can output their distribution, right, or histogram. And by design of the algorithm, if I give you another graph and the distribution is different, I can assure that the graphs are not isomorphic, right? So they're structurally different. We don't have edge-preserving bijection between their nodes. But if the histograms are the same, like in this case, we actually don't know, right? So it's a necessary but insufficient condition. And in fact, you can find examples of graphs, and these are examples from chemistry, right? Two different compounds that are completely different. They are not isomorphic, and yet the WL test cannot distinguish between them. Right, so basically the WL test, it's in theory gives us the expressive power, but in practice it is limited by certain cases. So there are entire families of graphs that cannot be distinguished between each other. What is worse is that from the practical perspective, it appears that some graphs might not be friendly for message passing, right? Because we need to actually send information, and we have finite precision computation. So what might happen is that if I send information from one blob here to another blob here, this information might be lost on the way, right? So this is typically referred to as oversquashing phenomenon, and this is not desired. So what we see in in theory, that we can go to higher order WL tests. So there is an entire hierarchy of them that are strictly more expressive than the lower dimensional ones, and we can design equivalent graph neural networks that mimic these higher dimensional, more expressive WL tests. And this way, you can distinguish between bigger classes of graphs. From the practical perspective, what is done is to decouple the input graph from the computational graph. And if your graph is unfriendly for message passing, maybe you will add or remove some edges to make the flow of information more efficient. So this is known under the general term of graph rewiring. And there are many works that try to rewire the graph in some principled ways. What it does, though, is that it breaks this theoretical link to the Weiss-Frey-Lehmann graph isomorphism test, because the Weiss-Frey-Lehmann test tells you that I give you the input graph and you need to propagate information exactly on this graph, right, in order to describe it in some way. So one standard way of bypassing this limitation is to augment the graph with some additional information. So you assume some structure or you invent some structure. So one typical way of doing it is by using what is called positional encoding or structural encoding. So again, this is very common in transformers. So you add some features that tell you where the node is located on your domain, right, in a graph or on a grid. And this information might be useful and used by message passing to make it more specific. You can also lift the graph to higher dimensional topological spaces. So instead of graphs which have zero-dimensional spaces, right, the nodes and one-dimensional edges, you can also have two-dimensional cells, right, or triangles, right, in simplicial complexes. And you can do more interesting message passing that goes across different dimensions of this cellular complex. You can also consider the graph as a collection of subgraphs extracted by some policy. Then you can do message passing on each of these graphs in a way that is coordinated. And again, this way we can guarantee that it is strictly more expressive than the WL test. There are actually deep links to what is called reconstruction conjectures in graph theory. As I mentioned already, you can also account for the symmetry of the data. And in special cases, when the graph has regularity, right, for example, when it becomes a grid, you can do more specific message passing, and then you can you go back to being basically convolutional neural networks. So the common denominator of these approaches is more structure, right? The other perspective we can take on graph neural networks is how much you trust your graph and how much you want to use it. So in one extreme case, you can say that I want to completely ignore the graph. So I have a collection of nodes, right? So it's a set with empty edge set, and it inherits the same permutation structure, permutation symmetry. So neural network architectures that operate in this way are called deep sets or point nets. So this is probably the simplest, the coarsest, the crudest architecture that you can think of. On the other extreme, we can allow for every pair of nodes to interact, right? So this corresponds to a fully connected or a complete graph. And this is how transformers operate. So you assume fully connected graph and you learn the graph that makes sense for the downstream task through the attention mechanism. So somewhere in the middle between these approaches sit all the different graph rewiring methods where you do propagation on some modified graph that is better for message passing in some sense, right? So you don't completely disregard your input graph because it might contain important information about the problem. So it's part of your input data, but you also make it more convenient for message passing, right? Avoiding all these problems of bottlenecks and oversquashing. Now, the standard approach to message passing is not very convenient from this perspective, right? Because if you look at what distinguishes between, let's say, grids, meshes, and graphs, right? So you can think of grids as special cases of graphs and meshes, as we said. So they are simplicial complexes. So they are graphs with some extra information, right? So you also have triangles. So the way that you aggregate information in these cases is very different, right? So on grids, you have fixed order of neighbors. On meshes, they are defined up to local rotation, as I said. And on graphs, they are defined up to permutation. So another distinction is that grids and meshes can be considered as discretized versions of some continuous underlying objects, such as a plane and a manifold. There is no such a clear perspective for graphs. And what we would like to do is to devise some continuous models for GNNs. And this is what we call physics-inspired GNNs. And basically, you can think of a graph neural network as a discretized dynamic system, where every node acts as a particle in some d-dimensional feature space, and it evolves along some trajectory. And the evolution equations that govern this evolution are given here by some set of differential equations. So we have n by d node coordinates, right, feature matrix that is now time dependent. So the time t here is continuous. And if you discretize it in time, for example, at fixed time steps, but they don't necessarily need to be fixed, you get layers of a graph neural network. Now, the way that these particles evolve, so they are not independent, they interact with each other. And how do they interact? They interact along the edges of the graph. So the graph can be considered as some kind of coupling mechanism between these particles. And in some cases, you can also consider it as discretization of some continuous spatial object. So basically, this allows us to think of a graph neural network as some finite difference equation that is obtained from a continuous differential equation. And typically, you parameterize this coupling function, right? So these will be the layers of the graph neural network. Now, out of many different differential equations that we can consider here, probably the first one that comes to mind is the heat equation. So it was studied first by Isaac Newton, who, with a homemade thermometer, conducted some experiments and described a mathematical law that nowadays we call the Newton law of cooling, that tells us that the temperature that the hot body loses in a given time is proportional to the temperature difference between the object and the environment. And it appears that this is actually a very general principle, very general mechanism you can apply to chemical diffusion. You can apply it even to very abstract things like propagation of rumors on a social network. And here's how it will look on a graph. So here the node features will represent some values of temperature, right? So think of hot nodes represented by red and cold nodes represented by blue. And basically what we see here is xi, right? So the feature at the node I itself is the self-temperature of the object. The sum or the average of the temperature of the nodes is the temperature of the environment, right? So it's the immediate environment of the node. And the rate of temperature change is the temporal derivative, right? So what we see here is a local differential version of Newton's law of cooling on a graph. So allow me to rearrange the terms here so I can write the right-hand side of this equation in this form. And what we see here in the brackets is a discrete version of the classical gradient operator from classical calculus, right? So what it takes is it takes a signal that lives on the nodes of the graph and makes it into a signal that lives on the edges of the graph. So if you're familiar with differential geometry, it's analogous to scalar fields and tangent vector fields, right? So we now have a new type of signal, right? A new functional space that now lives on the edges of the graph. And how it is defined, it's the difference between the endpoints of an edge, right? Now, this sum that appears here is the opposite operator. So it takes signals that live on the edges, looks at the edges that share a node and sums them up, right? So in calculus, we call this the divergence operator. So it represents the flux of a vector field through some infinitesimal volume. So in mathematical terms, it's formally adjoint to the gradient. So if you apply the gradient, it will take you from nodes to edges. If you apply the divergence, it will take you from the edges to the nodes. And if you apply them together, right, as minus divergence of the gradient or plus the divergence of the gradient, depending on the notation, you get what is called the Laplacian operator. So the Laplacian operator measures the difference of yourself from your environment, from your neighbors. And what we see here is the basic version of heat diffusion equation on the graph. It's called the homogeneous anisotropic heat equation. Here, delta, the Laplacian, is represented as a matrix, so it has the same structure as the adjacency matrix of the graph. It is typically sparse. Now, what we also know about this equation is that it's a prototypical example of what is called a gradient flow. So a gradient flow is a special class of evolution equations where the change in time, right, the temporal derivative is in the direction of negative gradient of some energy. So you can think of it as a variational or continuous version of steepest descent. And we know actually what is the energy that is associated with the heat equation. We call it the Dirichlet energy in physics. So what it measures is how smooth your node features are, right? So how different you are from your neighbors. So the smallest value of Dirichlet energy is 0, and it means that I'm exactly the same as my neighbors. So what the heat equation does, it actually decreases the Dirichlet energy. And in the limit, everything becomes constant, right? So all the nodes become the same. So we call this over-smoothing. And if you look at it from the perspective of a dynamic system, it means that all the features in this high-dimensional feature space collapse into a single point, right? So this is typically considered undesirable behavior, but it depends on the situation. So if you have a homophilic graph and you know the labels of some nodes, you can actually do a very simple trick. So you can apply a heat diffusion equation in the limit with some boundary conditions, right? So these will be the labels of the known nodes. And this is called label propagation. It's an extremely efficient approach that doesn't involve any learning. It works extremely well in homophilic graphs. It totally fails in the case the graphs are heterophilic. Now, if we go back again to how we design traditionally graph neural networks, right? Again, from this perspective of dynamic systems. So we start with a system of differential equations. We discretize the differential equations, right? So every step of every iteration of a solver becomes a layer in a neural network, and we parameterize it individually, right? So we parameterize evolution equations, essentially. What I'm suggesting to do, and this is the framework that we call gradient flow framework or graph, is to start with an energy and parameterize the energy. Now, obviously, not every evolution equation is given as a gradient flow. So it automatically restricts a lot your architectural choice. So it will impose certain restrictions on how you design your graph neural network. What you gain in exchange is some form of interpretability. And when I talk about interpretability, I mean that I will be able to prove mathematically that certain things happen or do not happen. So let me give you an example, right? So remember this discussion about convolutional neural networks not suitable for heterophilic graphs. So here we have a perfect example of heterophilic graph. So here the node colors represent labels, right? And you see that blue nodes have all red neighbors and vice versa. And the positions of the nodes represent some toy system of two-dimensional features, right? So the task here is to separate red nodes from blue nodes. And you see that there exist trajectories that pull them apart in the perfect way, right? So that we can completely separate the blues and the reds. So from the physical perspective, we can think of some kind of parametric Dirichlet energy. And we have two types of interactions. We have attractive interactions between these particles along the positive eigenvectors of this matrix W, right? That operates on the feature dimensions, and repulsive interactions along the corresponding negative directions. And the evolution equation, the gradient flow, looks like this. So you see that it is a convolutional type architecture, right? Why do I call it convolutional? Because the matrix that diffuses information on the graph is dependent only on the structure of the graph. It's independent on the features, right? And the mathematical result here is that this kind of convolutional GNNs, right, or linear graph diffusion, if we appropriately design the channel mixing matrix, W, it has to be symmetric. So symmetry is required for it to be an appropriate gradient flow. And it must have sufficiently large negative eigenvalues. So the repulsive or the sharpening part must counteract the blurring or the mixing part, the attractive part of the adjacency matrix. In this case, we can probably avoid oversmoothing. So in other words, this contradicts this folklore that is repeated in many papers on graph neural networks. That is actually not true. So these very simple architectures can deal very, very well with heterophilic settings. And here's an example. We have a graph where we can control the level of homophily. And you see that this framework allows us to deal with both homophilic and heterophilic settings. Now, I want to talk about continuous model for graphs. So far, the only thing that we made continuous was the time. And if we, again, look at how diffusion equations are discretized in the classical setting, right, on the grid, we actually have many ways of discretizing the Laplacian operator, right? So here are three examples, and any convex combination of them is also a legitimate discretization of the Laplacian. So we don't really have a canonical computational graph in this case, right? And that's the analogy I would like you to think about in graph neural networks. So without talking too much about it, because I don't have time, we actually can think of some non-Euclidean form of diffusion equations. We call them Beltrami flows. So here we have both positional coordinates and the Fisher coordinates, and we can evolve all of them, and we can evolve the graph appropriately. So here you can see that what is happening is two simultaneous processes. So the features that are represented by colors are diffused the positional coordinates that are represented by the positions of the circles are diffused, and the graph is rewired as this evolution happens. And here the task is to classify the nodes in 7 different classes. So this is the famous Cora graph, and you see that this is possible in almost perfect way. Now, it is also interesting that this kind of evolution, right, which might be a little bit disturbing if you come from the perspective of signal processing, is actually very common in differential geometry. So the fact that our domain is changing as long as we are at the same time as we are doing filtering on this domain, it is very common in what is called Ricci flows. So that was, as you probably know, the famous mechanism that was used by Perelman to prove 20 years ago the famous Poincare conjecture. So we subject a manifold to some evolution equation that changes its curvature, right? And as a result, it changes. So we can use curvature to analyze properties of graphs, right? And if curvature in the continuous case, it can be identified with geodesic dispersion. In other words, if I shoot geodesics from nearby points, I can track whether they converge, diverge, or remain parallel. And this allows us to locally distinguish between spherical, hyperbolic, or Euclidean geometry. So we can do something similar for graphs, right? So we can define a combinatorial notion of curvature on the edges of the graph and associate a number that will allow us to distinguish roughly between cliques and trees. Cliques are more benign for message passing than trees. And we can associate the presence of strongly negatively curved edges with these problems in message passing, what we call bottlenecks or oversquashing. And we can rewire the graph appropriately by removing these negatively curved edges to facilitate the flow of information. Now, one thing that you notice here is that these approaches for graph rewiring do not consider the task, right? So they consider the structure of the graph, but not actually the functions that we are trying to compute on the graph. And probably again, chemistry is a good example why this is important. So I can give you a molecule represented as a graph, right? So here nodes represent atoms and the edges represent chemical bonds. And in molecules, we can compute all sorts of interactions or forces, right? Let's say that we have what is called van der Waals interactions that decay very fast in space, and electrostatic or colonic interactions that decay very slowly. So if I want to do it with a graph neural network, I can ask the question, is the given graph adequate for this computation? And we see that in the first case of very fast decaying interactions, it will probably be sufficient, right? Because I can ignore safely everything that is far away. But in the second case, I will probably need more distant nodes for these interactions and maybe even a complete or a fully connected graph. So what you see here is that we have the same graph, the same features, but 2 different tasks, and whether the graph is good or not depends on the task. So we need to include the characterization of the task, and we can do it in the form of a characteristic that we call mixing. Allow me to skip the details. Basically, it's some bound on the second order derivatives or the Hessian of the function. So we can mix. We can describe the task in the form of mixing, and we can write this capacity bound relating the topology of the graph, the architecture, right? The graph neural network model, like the number of layers, bounds on the weights or the properties of the activation function. And we can ask questions of the form. For example, if we have a graph neural network of the message passing type with a certain number of layers, and the function that I want to compute with it requires high mixing, and the structure of the graph is such that there is a large commute time between the nodes, then this task cannot be computed by an MPNN. So in other words, it's a different way of thinking of expressive power without resorting to the Weisfeld-Lehmann graph isomorphism test formalism. Now, one thing that is missing from this picture about graph neural networks is basically different architectures, whether we consider general message passing attention or convolutional type architecture tells us what kind of information is sent, right? So how exactly I'm aggregating the information, I'm sending it to my node. The graph rewiring tells us where to send, right? So whether I use only my neighbors, or maybe I can remove some of the connections, or maybe I introduce some new connections. But again, we are thinking of it as a dynamic system. So what is missing is when to introduce this information. And again, allow me not to go into details. Basically, there are classes of architectures like our work from previous years ICML that we call DREW, or dynamic graph rewiring. Basically, we can delay the information and introduce it in the right moment where it would have arrived had it traveled on the graph by standard message passing, but without being mixed with the features of the neighbors. So this way we can guarantee that we don't have this loss of information. we can actually prove some theoretical properties about these architectures. They also appear in some settings more general than transformers, and they especially are advantages in situations when we have long-range interactions. So when the task requires sending information between distant nodes, and this is the case in many applications in chemistry. Now, another possibility is to think of graph neural networks from the perspective of what is the action that every node is doing, right? So in standard message passing, every node does two things. So it sends information to its neighbors, but also listens to the neighbors and receives information from them. And it doesn't need to be the case. So we can actually locally determine, we can define for every node whether at every layer it listens or broadcasts or both, right? So we have these 4 different combinations. We can broadcast and listen. We can listen only, we can only broadcast, or we can isolate. And this allows us to dynamically control the computational graph. So there is another graph neural network that determines the actions for every node. It's also interesting to consider it from the perspective of game theory. And again, here we can show that we are more expressive than graph neural networks. We can probably avoid phenomena such as oversquashing and oversmoothing. And it also works well for a certain class of tasks. Now, I know that I'm running out of time, so let me talk about some applications in molecular design. So I will first want to talk about the design of proteins. So proteins, as you probably know, they're most important molecules in biological systems. So you can say that we don't know any life form that is not based on proteins. In our body, proteins carry very important functions such as defending us against pathogens, right? Antibodies are special types of proteins. They deliver oxygen to our cells. They make happen catalytic chemical reactions, right? Enzymes are also proteins, transfer stuff across cellular membranes and so on and so forth. So proteins are sequences of amino acids. So biopolymers, we have a chain of simple building blocks, 20 amino acids connected together in a chain. And this chain, under the influence of electrostatic forces, folds into a 3-dimensional structure, a little bit like this snake toy, right? So it can twist and turn, and it creates these complicated structures. And what we want to do typically is to understand how to reverse this process, right? So if you want to design proteins that have certain structure, we want to design basically a chain of amino acids that will fold in a certain way. So the forward problem has been a long-standing problem in structural biology. For 50 years, it was postulated that the amino acid sequence in some environment determines the 3D structure of the protein. And as you know, AlphaFold was a deep learning-based breakthrough that allowed to address this problem. And why this is important? Because the structure of the protein is a little bit like the key and the lock, right? So same way as we have a unique configuration of these pins on a key that will fit in the lock and will be able to open it. Same way, the structure of the protein will have some pocket structures that will fit a particular molecule, right? That will bind a particular molecule, and then therefore this protein will be responsible for doing certain things in a biological organism, right? So we can think of proteins as, from basically a simple perspective, as sequences. Sequences fold in certain structures, and these structures endow the protein with certain function. And function, of course, can be understood in many different ways. So here, when I talk about function, I mean that the protein binds to something, right? So to other protein or to small molecule. So we had a lot of interesting results with considering proteins as surfaces, right? So basically you model the external molecular surface as a manifold. It allows to abstract out the internal structure that in many cases is irrelevant when you consider how proteins interact with each other and with other molecules. It also allows to address some conformational changes. And with my collaborators in Lausanne, the group of Bruno Correa, we developed geometric deep learning architectures. So basically these are architectures that come from the same blueprint. Something that I glossed over is basically working on meshes or on manifolds. Long story short, this allows us to design new proteins by basically predicting how they interact with each other. So here you can see actually an interesting example of molecular glue, right, or protein interaction that is activated by a small molecule. And we designed also and successfully tested in the lab binders for many interesting proteins. So here's an example of a binder for the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the coronavirus that was terrorizing us in the past several years. And same way as we have generative models for images, we can have generative models for proteins. So this is a work that we've done in a Canadian company called Dreamfold. So here you can see a generative model generating the backbone structure of a protein. And when we talk about generative models, as you probably know, basically it's a way of sampling from some data distribution that lives in high dimension. And if you try to do it directly, it's hopeless to model high dimensional distributions. We don't have enough data. So the breakthrough that was achieved recently with diffusion models is to try to do it by reversing a noising process, right? So you have a diffusion equation that takes you from data to noise, and you can try to reverse. So this is a diffusion equation, right? So we have the drift term here. Sorry, the diffusion term here, which is a Brownian motion, and the drift, which is the data point itself, right? And here alpha and beta are functions dependent on time that are designed in such a way that you start with the data with zero noise and you end up with pure noise without data. So the opposite direction is actually also a diffusion equation. And here there is the score function, right? So the log of the probability, which is we cannot compute, but we can approximate by a neural network. So this is called the score. And this is how the diffusion models are operated. So you basically train this neural network by predicting little denoising steps. So you add a little bit of noise to the image, and you train the network to remove this noise. So basically, what it allows you to do is to sample these trajectories that start with noise and go back to the data, and this way it allows you to sample from the data distribution. So another class of approaches on which generative models are based is flow matching. So you try to map one probability distribution to another, right? So let's say source, we call it P naught, and target P1. So there is some diffeomorphic mapping that takes us from one distribution to another. And it can be written in this equation. So where we have some kind of vector field that gradually flows one distribution into another. And again, here, this field is represented as a neural network, and this is what you learn. So there are all sort of flavors to these problems. So you can do flow matching on non-Euclidean domains. You can do flow matching with a learnable metric that allows actually your trajectories to lie within the data distribution. You can also do interesting flow matching on a discrete categorical data by mapping it on some non-Euclidean domain and then applying Riemannian flow matching in this situation. So allow me to skip this because I don't have time. So let me show you one example of how we can use Riemannian flow matching to generate protein backbones. So as I said, you can think of a protein backbone, right, which is the shared parts in amino acids. So amino acid contains the heavy atoms and the side chain that differs across them. So you can think of some kind of abstract idealized system of coordinates, right, what is called a local frame, and they're attached together. So you can think of local frame as an element of the special Euclidean group, right, SE3. So you have rotations, translations, but no reflections. And the entire structure of the protein, when you have n such amino acids, can be seen as a product of these groups. So these are Lie groups. We can think of them as manifolds, and we have a product of manifolds. Long story short, we can do flow matching on this manifold. So we have an architecture that allows us to generate new proteins. So we have proteins that are diverse, that are designable. So this is a comparison in terms of novelty. So the distance to the training set, that is the protein database, and the fraction of designable samples, right, that you can refold correctly. So you see that here, for example, we significantly beat RF diffusion. So RF diffusion is a generative model from the group of David Baker that now they recently got $1 billion investment to build it to generate drugs. So you can see that this approach that we developed is significantly better, at least from this perspective. You can also do interesting things like what is called motif scaffolding. So often when you design proteins, you know certain part that binds to your target, so you want to keep it, and all the rest, the rest of the protein you want to generate. So here is an example of how it might look like, right? So here we have the fixed part of the protein represented in orange, and the blue part is generated. And you can also do molecular dynamics. So instead of running a very complicated and very computationally intense solver, you can basically sample different conformations of proteins using this generative model. And it works significantly better than previous approaches such as ESM-fold. So I will show one example. This is actually a very typical workflow in drug design, what is called fragment-based drug design. It is also a typical way of designing molecular glues that bring together different proteins and make them interact. Typical application is protein degradation, where you bring E3 ligase with a protein, and then the protein is degraded within the cell. So the setting for this problem is you have molecular fragments, what is called pharmacophores. So these are little molecular compounds with known properties. You know how they bind to proteins, and you want to connect them together by another molecule. So this is called the linker. So it's a kind of in-painting problem, right? We assume that we know the positions of these fragments, and we want to diffuse, right? We want to generate the linking structure. Again, we can use here the diffusion model. And this is how it might look like. So this is a connecting of different fragments. It doesn't need to be two, it can be more, any arbitrary number. We can also condition it on the structure of the protein pocket, right? So we can generate valid molecules that do not actually intersect with the geometry of our target. And we actually have first experimental validation. So again, this was work done with Bruno. So the binders that we designed in this way do actually bind, maybe not in the best way, to our target protein. I think this is BRD4, an important oncological target. And I should say that it took us a lot of time to publish this paper, so it was rejected, I think, from all ML conferences where it's sent. So the reviewers told us that this is not an interesting problem, even though probably half of the drugs are designed in real life using these methods. But it is interesting that one of the co-authors was Max Welling. So he now has a startup where they try to design new materials for carbon capture. So these are materials that are called metal organic frameworks. And apparently in this domain, people like very much our diff linker, and they use it to design these new materials. So hopefully in the future, this will have a big impact on the to counteract climate change by capturing carbon from the atmosphere. But at least for those who are students here, don't get discouraged if your paper gets rejected, because you'll never know whether it will be used for something else. So I'm out of time, so let me summarize. I hope to have convinced you that geometric deep learning is a powerful tool that we can use for molecular modeling. It has roots in fundamental mathematical principles such as invariance and symmetry. You can use it also in the setting of generative models. I think it's very interesting and very virgin field of research where you can do a lot of things, and the mathematics there is beautiful. I think what is missing is experimental validation. So I think it's very important, if you work on these problems, you work with domain experts that actually know interesting problems and know how to build these molecules in the wet lab, because on paper you can do whatever you want, but it often fails to work in real life. And I started with a quote. I wanted to finish with a quote. This one is from Helvetius, who said famously that the knowledge of principles compensates for the lack of knowledge of facts. And I think this is the kind of mindset of geometric deep learning. So you don't want to memorize different deep learning architectures. You want to be able to derive them from first principle, which in this case is invariance and symmetry. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. Yeah, and let me know if you have questions, if we have time.
Hello, Michael, can you hear us?
Yep.
Amazing. Thank you so much again for the great talk. We're running a bit over on time, but we have time for maybe a few questions. So if you raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. And please keep it to one question when you get the mic. Any questions? There we go.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for the talk. I do wonder if you have like an explanation why the flow matching and all these stuff work better than the fusion models. I don't have the intuition for flow matching yet, but I would like a simple explanation.
I mean, it's probably hard to say whether I wouldn't be as categorical to say that it works better. I think it's easier to make it work for different types of distribution. So it doesn't need to be necessarily a Gaussian distribution. So it can be any distribution to any distribution. And it's easier to incorporate different geometries. So I should say, maybe I didn't mention it. So the foundational work there was done by Jaron Lippmann, who's, well, an old friend and collaborator many years ago. Yeah, and these are methods, they are very new. I think they're just a couple of years old. So I wouldn't say categorically that flow matching is necessarily better than diffusion.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I had a question about the theory of GNNs. Like, there's this misconception that people think that if a model is more expressive, they should get better results on their experiments, and sometimes people get disappointed because of that. You mentioned some other pieces of theory, like there are over-smoothing, over-squashing problem, and like where, when, and these things. And maybe another thing coming to my mind is like generalization theory that is still missing. Are there any other pieces of theory that you have in your mind that we need to work on and we don't know about that? The reason that more expressive models not necessarily do better when like on some data sets.
Yeah, so, well, I think expressivity is not enough, right? Because, well, if you take this argument to absurd, you can say that, well, why do we need any architectures when we have MLPs, right? And they're universal, so we could use just MLPs. So, of course, expressive power is not enough. You have problems with generalization. You can also, so what we actually have, I invited to look at a position paper that will appear at ICML. So with many co-authors, we write about open problems and interesting directions in the theory of graph neural networks. So one of them that we highlight is fine-grained expressive power. Basically, I think the WL formalism, while it was important for basically understanding what kind of functions you can express, I think it in a sense it made a bad service, because sometimes when you use KWL analogies and you look at how, in terms of certain structures that you can compute on a graph, for example, it's sometimes over the board, right? So it's too many things that you maybe don't need for your particular tasks. So you need something fine-grained. So you want to be able to say that I want only these structures for my functions. So we have also a paper in the CML where we use what is called homomorphism basis to do it, so to do fine-grained expressive power. So there are many questions related to expressive power. There are many questions related to generalization. I think it's fair to say that it's poorly understood. There are just few works that try to analyze properly the generalization power of GNNs. Christopher Morris had a paper and a few others, but I think it's still largely open.